There is a mansion perched on the cliffs of Newport, Rhode Island, known to television audiences as the haunted estate of Collinwood. For 5 years, dark shadows transformed this limestone palace into America's most famous Gothic residence, home to vampire Barnabas Collins and the cursed family who bore his name. But long before cameras arrived in 1966, Seaview Terrace had earned its reputation through events far more disturbing than any scriptwriter imagined. Deaths, bankruptcies, and mysterious misfortunes followed its owners with such consistency that the mansion became Newport's most notorious address. When Dan Curtis searched for the perfect location to film his supernatural soap opera, he found a building that required no special effects to appear haunted. This is the story of Seaview Terrace, where reality wrote the script. In the summer of 1923, Newport, Rhode Island, stood as the undisputed capital of American excess. Along Ocean Drive and Bellevue Avenue, the wealthiest families in the nation had constructed what they carefully called summer cottages, though the term hardly captured the reality of these palaces. The Breakers, built by Cornelius Vanderbilt II, contained 70 rooms spread across 125,000 square feet. Marble House, commissioned by Alva Vanderbilt, featured a ballroom modeled after the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Rosecliffe recreated the Grand Trianon. These were not homes, they were declarations of financial supremacy rendered in limestone, marble, and gilt. Into this landscape of competitive grandeur came Edson Bradley. Bradley had been born on the 12th of January 1863 in Chicago, the son of a prominent physician who had invested early and wisely in copper mining operations throughout the American West. When his father died in 1894, Edson inherited control of mining interests that stretched from Michigan's Upper Peninsula to the mountains of Arizona. By 1920, the Bradley Mining Company was producing millions of pounds of copper annually. Edson Bradley ranked among the 10 wealthiest individuals in the United States. His personal fortune was estimated at approximately $80 million, a sum that would approach $1.2 billion in contemporary currency. But Bradley had no interest in merely managing the family business. When he turned 60, he decided Newport required his attention. He wanted to build something that would outlast him, something that would establish the Bradley name among the families who had defined American aristocracy for the previous half-century. He wanted a palace. In 1922, Bradley purchased a parcel of land on the eastern edge of Newport, where Oker Point Avenue met the Atlantic Ocean. The property occupied the highest point along the coastline, with cliffs dropping nearly 60 feet to the rocks below. From this elevation, the entire sweep of the Atlantic stretched to the horizon. Bradley paid $175,000 for the land, approximately $3 million in modern terms. He intended to spend considerably more on what would rise above it. Bradley commissioned Howard Greenlee, a New York architect who had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Greenlee was 43 years old, at the height of his creative powers. He understood exactly what Bradley wanted. The style would be French Renaissance, inspired by the chateau of the Loire Valley, but adapted to the requirements of a modern American residence. The exterior would be clad in Indiana limestone, chosen for its durability against the salt air, and its ability to be carved into the elaborate ornamentation that the style demanded. The roof would feature dormers, turrets, and a central tower rising 5 stories above the main structure. Construction began in the spring of 1923. Bradley hired the George A. Fuller Company, the same firm that had built the Flatiron Building in New York. More than 200 workers descended on the site. They excavated the foundation, sinking support columns deep into the bedrock. Steel framework rose through the summer and fall. By winter, the limestone facade had begun to take shape. The design called for 64 rooms spread across 4 principal floors, with additional servants' quarters in the attic and utility spaces in the basement. The ground floor would contain the public rooms, a grand entrance hall rising 2 stories, a drawing room measuring 40 feet by 30 feet with carved oak paneling imported from a 16th century French chateau, a library with built-in bookcases for Bradley's collection of first editions, a ballroom capable of accommodating 200 guests occupying the entire southern wing. The second floor would contain the family bedrooms and private sitting rooms. Bradley's own suite would occupy the entire western corner, with windows facing both the ocean and the gardens. Julia Bradley's suite would mirror her husband's on the opposite side of the hall. Guest rooms, each with its own bathroom and fireplace, would fill the remaining space. The third floor would house additional guest accommodations and servants' rooms. The tower represented Greenlee's most dramatic gesture. Rising 90 feet above the ground, it would serve no practical purpose beyond providing a viewing platform accessible by a spiral staircase. From the tower's observation room, visitors could survey the entire estate and watch ships passing along the horizon. Bradley had specified that the tower should be visible from every major road approaching Newport, a landmark announcing his arrival among the city's elite families. The construction proceeded through 1924 and into 1925. The final cost would exceed $2 million, approximately $35 million in contemporary dollars. The figure did not include furnishings, which Bradley purchased during trips to Europe, tapestries from Flemish workshops, furniture attributed to André Charles Boule, paintings by minor French masters of the 18th century. Each piece was documented, insured, and shipped across the Atlantic. In June of 1925, the Bradley family took up residence. Servants unpacked trunks. Furniture was positioned according to detailed floor plans. The kitchen staff began preparing meals in a kitchen equipped with the most modern appliances available. Seaview Terrace, as Bradley had named the estate, was ready to take its place among the great houses of Newport. The newspapers noted the completion with brief announcements. The Bradley family had joined the summer colony. What the newspapers did not report was that Bradley had built his monument at precisely the wrong moment. The copper market had begun to soften in 1924. By 1925, prices were falling steadily as post-war demand declined and new mines in South America flooded the market with cheaper ore. Bradley's mining operations, which had generated immense profits during the war years, were now struggling to break even. The mansion required a staff of 26 to maintain. The annual operating costs exceeded $100,000. Bradley had built his palace, but palaces require constant feeding, and the source of that wealth was drying up faster than anyone outside the family's private councils understood. By the time the Bradley family hosted their first formal dinner at Seaview Terrace in August of 1925, the financial pressures were already mounting. The guests who admired the limestone facade and the French tapestries had no way of knowing that the family who welcomed them was beginning a slide toward ruin that the mansion itself would accelerate. The interior of Seaview Terrace reflected Edson Bradley's determination to establish his family among Newport's aristocracy through sheer magnificence of detail. The entrance hall rose 2 full stories, its walls paneled in oak that had been salvaged from a chateau in the Loire Valley and reassembled by craftsmen who spent 6 months fitting each piece into place. The curved staircase ascended to a landing where a stained glass window depicted a pastoral scene of shepherds and their flocks. The glass itself dating to the 17th century, light filtered through the colored panes in the afternoon, casting blue and amber patterns across the marble floor. The drawing room featured a fireplace carved from cane stone, its mantelpiece supported by caryatides copied from models at Fontainebleau. Above the mantel hung a painting attributed to François Boucher. The furniture had been selected to match the room's proportions. Settees upholstered in silk damask, side tables with marquetry tops, a pianoforte that had belonged to a minor member of the Habsburg family and still bore their coat of arms inlaid in the lid. The library occupied the opposite side of the entrance hall, its walls lined floor to ceiling with bookcases constructed of American walnut. Bradley had assembled a collection of approximately 3,000 volumes, including first editions of Dickens, Thackeray, and the complete works of Shakespeare in a folio from 1685. A reading table stood in the center of the room, illuminated by a chandelier that had been converted from candles to electricity. The windows looked out over the gardens toward the ocean, providing a view that Bradley's architect had carefully framed to exclude any sight of neighboring properties. The ballroom occupied the entire southern wing of the ground floor. measuring 70 feet in length and 40 feet in width. Its ceiling rose 20 feet above a floor of inlaid parquetry in a pattern of concentric diamonds. Crystal chandeliers hung from gilt rosettes. French doors opened onto a terrace that extended the length of the room. The ballroom could accommodate 200 guests comfortably, though the Bradley family would host only 3 large gatherings during their tenure at Seaview Terrace. The kitchen occupied the basement level, equipped with commercial-grade appliances, 3 ovens, 2 ranges, a refrigeration unit that occupied an entire wall. Storage rooms held supplies sufficient to feed the family and staff for a month without resupply. The wine cellar maintained a constant temperature of 55 degrees and housed Bradley's collection of French vintages, including several cases of Chateau Lafite from the 1872. The second floor contained the family's private apartments. Bradley's suite occupied the southwestern corner, with windows facing both the ocean and the rose garden that Julia Bradley had commissioned in the spring of 1926. His bedroom measured 30 feet by 20 feet. An adjoining sitting room provided space for private meetings. A bathroom featured marble imported from Carrara and fixtures of polished nickel. Julia Bradley's suite mirrored her husband's on the opposite side of the central hallway. The tower rose from the center of the house, accessible by a spiral staircase that began on the 3rd floor and climbed through 90 feet of vertical space to an observation room at the summit. The room itself measured 12 feet in diameter, with windows facing in every direction. From this vantage point, the entire estate was visible. Bradley had commissioned a telescope for the room, mounted on a tripod near the eastern window. He would climb to the tower on clear evenings to watch ships passing along the horizon. The estate itself occupied 12 acres. The grounds had been landscaped according to plans drawn by Frederick Law Olmsted, Jr. Formal gardens occupied the southern exposure, with boxwood hedges trimmed into geometric patterns. A fountain stood at the intersection of the main paths, though it was rarely operated because the sound of rushing water competed with the constant murmur of the ocean just beyond the cliff edge. The operating costs for Seaview Terrace exceeded $100,000 annually. The property taxes alone amounted to $18,000 per year, more than most American families earned in a decade. These expenses represented a manageable burden for a man of Bradley's wealth in 1925, but they would become increasingly difficult to sustain as his mining operations deteriorated through the latter half of the decade. The first sign of trouble came in the autumn of 1926. Bradley received word that copper prices had fallen below the cost of production at his largest mine in Arizona. The mine employed 300 workers and had operated profitably for 30 years. Bradley ordered operations suspended until market conditions improved. They would never resume. By early 1927, 2 additional mines had been forced to close. The income that had sustained Bradley's lifestyle was vanishing, but the mansion on the cliff required feeding regardless of market conditions. Julia Bradley noticed the change first. Her husband spent increasing amounts of time in his study, reviewing ledgers and conducting telephone conversations with mining supervisors and financial advisors. The dinner parties that had characterized their first 2 summers at Seaview Terrace became less frequent. When guests did arrive, Bradley often excused himself early, retreating to his tower room where he would sit in darkness, watching the ocean. In June of 1928, Bradley suffered what his physician described as a nervous collapse. He was 65 years old. The strain of watching his fortune disintegrate had manifested in physical symptoms that could no longer be ignored. Sleeplessness, loss of appetite, episodes of confusion. He spent 3 weeks confined to his bedroom while Julia Bradley supervised his care and attempted to maintain the appearance of normalcy. When Bradley finally emerged from his room, he appeared diminished. He had lost weight. His face had taken on a gray cast. On the morning of the 15th of September 1928, a chambermaid discovered Edson Bradley in the tower room at the top of the house. He had climbed the spiral staircase sometime during the night and seated himself in the chair facing the eastern window. The telescope remained covered. The dawn light was just beginning to illuminate the ocean when the maid found him. He was dead at the age of 65. The physician who examined the body determined that Bradley had suffered a massive heart attack. He had died alone, looking out over the Atlantic, toward a horizon he would never reach. The mansion he had built to announce his greatness had witnessed instead his ruin. And this would not be the last time that Seaview Terrace demanded a price for its grandeur. The funeral was held 3 days later at Trinity Church in Newport, the same church where the Vanderbilts and Astors had buried their own. The service was well attended by Newport society, though the mourners came more out of obligation than genuine grief. Bradley had never quite penetrated the inner circles of the summer colony. He had built the grandest house, but he had arrived too late and with too much eagerness. Few mourners lingered. Julia Bradley found herself at 60 years old, the owner of a mansion she could not afford to maintain, and heir to a mining empire that no longer generated income. The estate, when finally settled, was valued at approximately $4 million, less than 1/20th of the figure that newspapers had estimated during Bradley's lifetime. Most of this wealth was tied up in mining properties that could not be sold. The liquid assets available to Julia amounted to less than $300,000. After taxes and debts were settled, she was left with approximately $150,000. The annual operating costs alone would consume her remaining capital within 18 months. Julia Bradley chose to sell. In November of 1928, just 2 months after her husband's death, she listed Seaview Terrace with a Newport real estate firm. The asking price was $750,000. The agents prepared a prospectus describing the mansion's features and distributed it to potential buyers in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. No offers arrived. The spring of 1929 came and went without a single serious inquiry. Julia Bradley reduced the price to $650,000 in June. Still nothing. She spent that summer living alone in the mansion with a skeleton staff of 6. The ballroom remained closed. The guest rooms stood empty. The tower, where her husband had died, was locked. Julia avoided that part of the house entirely. By October of 1929, when the stock market collapsed and the nation began its slide into the Great Depression, Seaview Terrace had been on the market for nearly a year. The crash eliminated what little demand remained. Julia Bradley reduced the price again to $500,000, then to $400,000. The agents advised her that the market had essentially ceased to exist. No one was buying estates. She would have to wait. In the spring of 1930, Julia Bradley received an offer of $250,000 from a businessman in New York. She accepted immediately. The sale closed in June. Julia packed what belongings she could transport, arranged for the remainder to be auctioned, and departed Newport for the last time. She would live another 8 years, dying in a modest apartment in Philadelphia in 1938. She never returned to Rhode Island. The businessman who purchased Seaview Terrace was named Joseph Friedman. He was 42 years old, a garment manufacturer who had built a successful business producing women's coats and dresses. Friedman had watched the stock market crash with concern, but had emerged relatively unscathed. While others panicked, he saw opportunity. Real estate prices had collapsed. Properties that had sold for millions just years before were now available for fractions of their construction costs. Friedman believed the depression would be brief. His plan was straightforward: convert the mansion into a private social club for wealthy Jewish families who were excluded from Newport's established institutions. The Newport Country Club, the Newport Reading Room, and the other bastions of WASP society had always maintained informal but absolute barriers against Jewish membership. Friedman envisioned Seaview Terrace as an alternative. He moved his family into the mansion in July of 1930 and immediately began renovations. The ballroom would serve for dinners and dances. The drawing room and library would function as lounges. Guest rooms would be available for members visiting from out of town. He hired an architect to design a swimming pool and tennis courts on the southern lawn. The total cost of these improvements was budgeted at $75,000. The club opened in the summer of 1931 with 48 founding members who each paid an initiation fee of $1,000. The first season appeared promising. Members hosted dinners. Their children played on the tennis courts. The pool was used constantly through September, but when the bills came due at the end of the season, Friedman discovered that the operating costs exceeded his projections by nearly 40%. The second season saw membership decline to 39 families. The depression was deepening. Even successful businessmen were cutting back on luxuries. Friedman reduced the annual dues from $500 to $300, but the reduction only confirmed what members already suspected: the club was failing. By the end of the 1933 season, membership had fallen to 22 families. Friedman had invested more than $400,000 in the property. He could not continue. In the spring of 1934, Joseph Friedman listed Seaview Terrace for sale at $200,000. The property remained on the market for 14 months before an offer arrived. The buyer was Edith Wetmore, widow of George Peabody Wetmore, who had served as governor of Rhode Island and United States Senator. Edith Wetmore was 78 years old when she purchased Seaview Terrace in July of 1935 for $185,000. She had no intention of living there. She bought the property to prevent it from being subdivided or demolished. The mansion would stand empty under her ownership for the next 4 years, maintained by a caretaker who lived in the garage apartments. The caretaker, a man named Thomas Brennan, reported to Mrs. Wetmore's estate managers that the house was difficult to heat, impossible to keep clean, and subject to strange drafts that seemed to originate from no identifiable source. Doors that he locked in the evening stood open in the morning. Windows rattled without wind. The tower staircase troubled him particularly. He avoided climbing it whenever possible, claiming that the air in the tower room felt different from the rest of the house. Colder, heavier. Brennan was not a superstitious man. He had worked as a groundskeeper for the Wetmore family for 20 years. But Seaview Terrace unsettled him in ways he could not articulate. When Mrs. Wetmore's agents asked him to explain his concerns, he struggled to provide specifics. The house simply felt wrong, he told them. He requested a transfer to another property. The request was granted in the spring of 1939. His replacement, a younger man named Robert Hayes, lasted 7 months before submitting his own resignation. He offered no explanation beyond the standard notice required by his contract. The pattern was already established. Seaview Terrace had stood for barely 15 years, but it had already claimed one fortune, destroyed one business venture, and driven away 2 caretakers who could not explain what troubled them. And the darkness was only beginning. By 1940, Edith Wetmore had grown weary of maintaining a property she would never occupy. She was 83 years old, and her health was failing. The costs of keeping Seaview Terrace minimally maintained exceeded $12,000 annually. The building was deteriorating. The roof leaked. The ornamental ironwork had begun to rust. The gardens had gone wild. In March of 1940, Edith Wetmore sold Seaview Terrace to a corporation called Ocean View Properties for $125,000. The principals were 3 brothers named Clarence, Harold, and Morton Kaplan, developers from Providence who specialized in converting large estates into multi-unit residential buildings. They saw Seaview Terrace as ideal for similar treatment. The building's size and layout would allow for the creation of 12 to 15 luxury apartments. The Kaplans estimated they could complete the conversion for $200,000 and rent the units at rates that would provide a return of 12% annually. The conversion began in the summer of 1940. Workers divided the interior spaces, installing new walls and creating separate entrances. The grand staircase remained intact, but additional staircases were added at the rear. Kitchens were installed in spaces that had served other purposes. Bathrooms were added. The ballroom was subdivided into 4 apartments, destroying its original proportions but creating the largest units in the building. By December of 1940, the conversion was substantially complete. The first tenants moved in during January of 1941. Within 6 months, 12 of the 15 apartments were occupied. Rents ranged from $150 to $300 per month, depending on size and location. The building generated approximately $2,500 monthly, enough to cover operating costs and provide the projected return. For 3 years, Seaview Terrace functioned as the Kaplans had envisioned. The difficulties began in 1944. Several tenants reported problems with heating. Despite the building's supposedly modern systems, certain apartments remained persistently cold during winter months. The Kaplans hired contractors to inspect the boilers and ductwork. The systems were functioning properly. The engineers could identify no mechanical reason for the temperature variations. Nevertheless, two tenants vacated their apartments in March of 1944, citing the heating problems as their reason for leaving. Both apartments were on the upper floors, in what had been the family quarters during the Bradley era. Other complaints accumulated. Tenants reported hearing footsteps in hallways during hours when no one should be present. Doors that had been left open stood closed. Items disappeared from apartments and reappeared days later in different locations. A tenant on the third floor claimed that her jewelry had been taken from a locked drawer and found a week later arranged on her dining table. She accused the building's superintendent of entering her apartment without permission. The superintendent, a man named Vincent Russo, who had worked for the Kaplans for 15 years, denied the accusation vehemently. By the end of 1944, 6 apartments stood vacant. The Kaplans reduced rents by 20% to attract new tenants. 5 of the empty units were re-leased by spring of 1945, but the turnover rate remained higher than the brothers had experienced at their other properties. Tenants stayed an average of 14 months before leaving. Exit interviews revealed a consistent pattern. The apartments were beautiful. The location was excellent, but something about the building made people uncomfortable. The building felt oppressive, several said. It was too quiet, others claimed. A few mentioned bad dreams that ceased when they moved elsewhere. Vincent Russo also noticed changes. He had been living in an apartment on the ground floor since the conversion was completed, but in 1946 he requested permission to move to the garage apartments. The Kaplans questioned his decision. The ground floor apartment was larger and more convenient. Russo explained that he preferred the separation between his residence and his work. The real reason, which he shared only with his wife, was that he could no longer sleep comfortably in the main house. He would wake at 3 in the morning convinced that someone was walking through the hallways. He would investigate and find nothing. The feeling persisted regardless. In 1947, a tenant named Margaret Sullivan died in her 4th-floor apartment. She was 72 years old and had been in poor health for several years. The death itself was unremarkable, attributed to heart failure. What troubled the other tenants was that Mrs. Sullivan had lived alone and had not been discovered until 3 days after her death. A neighbor had finally alerted the superintendent when newspapers began accumulating outside her door. "People died alone," the tenants whispered. No one noticed. The Kaplan brothers sold Seaview Terrace in January of 1949 to a real estate investment trust based in Boston. The sale price was $175,000. Less than the brothers had invested 9 years earlier. The trust that purchased the property intended to continue operating it as apartments, but within 18 months, they too were struggling with vacancy rates and tenant complaints. The building passed to another owner in 1951, then another in 1953. Each sale represented a loss for the previous owner. Each new owner believed they could succeed where predecessors had failed. Each discovered the same problems. The building was difficult to heat. Tenants left without clear explanations. Maintenance costs exceeded projections. Strange occurrences accumulated. A tenant reported seeing a figure in the tower staircase that vanished when approached. Another claimed that the elevator would sometimes operate without anyone pressing the call button, stopping at the 4th floor, where the doors would open onto an empty hallway. These reports were dismissed as imagination or exaggeration, but they contributed to a reputation that made the building increasingly difficult to lease. By 1958, Seaview Terrace had passed through 6 different owners in 18 years. The current owner had reduced rents to the point where the building barely covered its operating costs. 10 of the 15 apartments stood vacant. The remaining tenants were transients, people who stayed for a few months before moving on. The building that Edson Bradley had constructed to announce his arrival among Newport's elite had become a marginal property, neither profitable enough to warrant investment nor valuable enough to justify demolition. It stood on its cliff overlooking the Atlantic, slowly deteriorating, waiting for someone to determine its fate. That someone arrived in the spring of 1959. The property was sold once again, this time to a charitable organization that saw potential for institutional use. The new owners planned to convert Seaview Terrace into a residence for elderly women. The conversion would require substantial renovations, but the organization had funding secured and contractors ready to begin work. The conversion began in the summer of 1959 and continued through 1960. The apartment divisions were removed, restoring some of the building's original open spaces. Common areas were created on the ground floor. Bedrooms for residents occupied the upper floors. Medical facilities and administrative offices were installed in the basement. The building opened as a residence in January of 1961 with capacity for 48 women. Within 6 months, occupancy reached 42, but the same complaints that had plagued the apartment years resurfaced. Residents reported feeling cold despite adequate heating. Staff members avoided certain areas of the building, particularly the tower and the 4th floor. Several residents requested room changes without providing clear reasons. The turnover rate among staff was notably high. The organization's administrators attributed these problems to the building's age and the challenges inherent in operating an institutional facility in a structure designed as a private residence. They did not acknowledge what the pattern suggested. Seaview Terrace was not merely difficult to maintain, it was becoming impossible to occupy comfortably. And in 1966, Hollywood would arrive to film a building that already was what the cameras pretended it to be. In the autumn of 1965, a television producer named Dan Curtis sat in his New York office, reviewing location photographs for a project that had consumed his attention for the previous 18 months. Curtis was 40 years old, a former salesman who had moved into television production during the medium's explosive growth in the 1,950 seconds. He had produced game shows and variety programs, work that paid well but offered little creative satisfaction. What Curtis wanted was something different. He had developed a concept that was audacious, a Gothic soap opera set in present day but haunted by the past. The story would follow the Collins family, descendants of a wealthy New England dynasty whose ancestral estate concealed 2 centuries of dark secrets. There would be ghosts, curses, and eventually a vampire. The show would air 5 days a week in the late afternoon, targeting the audience that had made soap operas a cultural phenomenon. Curtis had pitched the idea to ABC executives who were skeptical but willing to take a chance. The network had committed to 13 weeks of episodes beginning in June of 1966. Curtis had 6 months to assemble a cast, hire writers, and find locations. The most critical location was the mansion itself. Curtis needed a building that would serve as the exterior for Collinwood, the Collins family estate. It had to be large enough to suggest wealth and power across generations. It had to be Gothic in style, preferably with towers and elaborate architectural detail. It had to be isolated, surrounded by grounds that could pass for a private estate, and it had to be accessible from New York, where the interiors would be filmed in a studio. Curtis and his location scout had spent months searching through New England, photographing dozens of estates from Massachusetts to Maine. Nothing had satisfied him. Most of the Gothic Revival mansions built during the 19th century had been demolished or converted to institutional uses. Those that remained in private hands were unavailable for filming. Curtis was beginning to consider alternatives when his location scout suggested they try Newport. They drove to Newport on a gray morning in November of 1965. The location scout had prepared a list of properties to examine. Curtis looked at the Breakers, Marble House, and Rosecliff. All were impressive, but none felt right. The Breakers was too ornate, Marble House was too classical, Rosecliff was too delicate. Curtis wanted something darker, something that looked as though it harbored secrets. The location scout mentioned one additional property. It was called Seaview Terrace, currently operating as a residence for elderly women, but available for exterior photography if arrangements could be made. They found the mansion on Ochre Point Avenue in the late afternoon. Curtis saw it first as a silhouette against the darkening sky. The limestone facade rose 4 stories, topped by a tower that extended another level above the roofline. Dormers and turrets broke the roofline at irregular intervals. The building dominated its cliff-edge site, isolated from its neighbors by walls and overgrown gardens. Curtis understood immediately that he had found Collinwood. He contacted the organization that owned the property and negotiated permission to photograph the exterior for television use. The fee was modest, less than $500 for unlimited access during the show's first season. The organization's administrators were pleased to have the income and saw no harm in allowing a television crew to film the building's facade. Curtis arranged for his crew to return in the spring to capture the footage that would be used throughout the series. When Dark Shadows premiered on the 27th of June, 1966, viewers across America were introduced to Seaview Terrace, though they knew it only as Collinwood. The show's premise established the Collins family as descendants of a dynasty founded in 1,690 inches, the fictional town of Collinsport, Maine. Their estate, Collinwood, had been rebuilt several times over the centuries, most recently in the 1,892 in the French Renaissance style. The current generation consisted of Elizabeth Collins Stoddard, a reclusive widow who had not left the estate in 18 years, her daughter Carolyn, and Elizabeth's brother Roger Collins with his son David. A young woman named Victoria Winters arrived to serve as David's governess, and her presence triggered the revelation of family secrets that had remained buried for decades. For the first 6 months, Dark Shadows struggled to find an audience. The ratings were poor. ABC executives discussed cancellation. Curtis knew he needed something dramatic to save the show. In December of 1966, he made a decision that would transform Dark Shadows from a failing experiment into a cultural phenomenon. He introduced a vampire, Barnabas Collins, a distant cousin who had been imprisoned in a coffin since 1795, was accidentally released and returned to Collinwood. The character was played by a Canadian actor named Jonathan Frid, who brought unexpected depth and pathos to what might have been a conventional monster role. The vampire storyline rescued the show. Ratings climbed steadily through the spring of 1967. By summer, Dark Shadows had become ABC's highest-rated daytime program. Fan mail arrived by the thousands. Jonathan Frid became an unlikely celebrity. The show would continue until April of 1971, producing a total of 1,225 episodes and establishing itself as one of the most distinctive programs in television history. Throughout its 5-year run, Seaview Terrace remained Collinwood's exterior. Curtis's crew returned to Newport periodically to film additional footage. The mansion appeared in the opening credits of every episode, its tower silhouetted against storm clouds. Viewers who had never been to New England developed strong associations between the building and the Gothic atmosphere that Curtis had created. The mansion became, in the minds of millions, synonymous with vampires, ghosts, and the dark secrets that wealthy families concealed behind limestone facades. The cast and crew who traveled to Newport for filming sessions noticed certain qualities about Seaview Terrace that made it ideal for Curtis's purposes. The building genuinely looked haunted. Its isolation contributed to an atmosphere of unease. The tower, accessible by a narrow spiral staircase, felt wrong in ways that no one could articulate precisely. Several crew members reported feeling cold inside the building despite mild weather. A camera operator mentioned that his equipment had malfunctioned during a shoot in the tower room, though it functioned normally elsewhere. These experiences were discussed among the crew but never seriously investigated. The building was old. Old buildings had quirks. No one suggested that Seaview Terrace might actually be the kind of place that Dark Shadows pretended Collinwood to be. Jonathan Frid, who spent more time at the location than most of the cast, later recalled that Seaview Terrace made him uncomfortable in ways he struggled to explain. The building felt oppressive, he said in an interview decades after the show ended. There was something about the tower that bothered him particularly. He climbed it once during a break in filming and decided never to return. When asked what he had experienced, Frid declined to elaborate. "Just a feeling," he said. "Not the kind of place I wanted to linger." The show's popularity extended far beyond its original run. Dark Shadows entered syndication in 1975 and has aired continuously on various cable channels ever since. A feature film was released in 1970. A second film followed in 1971. A primetime remake was attempted in 1991. Another film adaptation, directed by Tim Burton and starring Johnny Depp, appeared in 2012. Each iteration introduced new audiences to Collinwood, and by extension to Seaview Terrace. The mansion became a pilgrimage site for fans who would drive to Newport, locate the building, and photograph themselves in front of the gates. What the fans could not have known was that during the years Dark Shadows was filming at Seaview Terrace, the building's real occupants were experiencing difficulties that had nothing to do with television production. The senior residents continued to operate, but staff turnover remained problematic. Residents complained about cold rooms and disturbed sleep. In 1968, a resident named Dorothy Hammond fell down the main staircase and died from her injuries. She was 81 years old. The death was ruled accidental, attributed to poor balance and inadequate lighting. No one suggested any other explanation, though several residents claimed that Mrs. Hammond had reported seeing figures in the hallways during the weeks before her death. The cameras captured a mansion playing itself, a place where darkness was not created by lighting directors but merely revealed. And when the show ended in 1971, the building remained, its reputation now permanent, its connection to Gothic horror secured for generations to come. The final episode of Dark Shadows aired on the 2nd of April, 1971. By then, the show had produced 1,225 episodes across 5 years, creating a devoted fan base that would sustain the property for decades. Dan Curtis moved on to other projects. The cast dispersed to other roles, though Jonathan Frid would forever be identified with Barnabas Collins. Seaview Terrace remained. The charitable organization that operated the senior residence continued to struggle with the same problems that had plagued earlier owners. Occupancy rates fluctuated. Staff turnover remained excessive. Residents complained about conditions that administrators could not adequately address. By 1972, the organization had concluded that maintaining Seaview Terrace as a residential facility was financially unsustainable. The building required extensive renovations that the organization could not afford. The operating costs exceeded the income generated by resident fees. After 11 years of trying to make the conversion work, the organization put the property up for sale. The asking price was $300,000, a figure that reflected both the building's condition and the difficulty of finding appropriate uses for estates of this scale. Several potential buyers examined the property during 1973 and 1974. A hotel developer considered converting it to a boutique inn but withdrew when renovation estimates came back at more than $2 million. A private school explored using it as a dormitory but determined that the building did not meet current safety codes. A real estate speculator offered $200,000, intending to demolish the mansion and subdivide the land for residential development. But local preservationists blocked the sale through zoning challenges. The property stood empty through 1975 and into 1976. The charitable organization continued to pay for minimal maintenance. The gardens reverted to wilderness. The swimming pool filled with leaves. Vandals broke several windows. Local teenagers discovered they could enter through an unlocked service door and began using the building for parties. The Newport police received complaints from neighbors. Officers who responded to these calls found the mansion unsettling. The teenagers they ejected claimed they had heard footsteps on upper floors when no one else was present. The officers attributed these claims to alcohol and imagination, but they noted in their reports that the building had an oppressive atmosphere even in daylight. In the spring of 1976, a private school based in Newport approached the organization about purchasing Seaview Terrace. Salve Regina College had been founded in 1934 as a Catholic women's college and had grown substantially in the decades since. The college already owned several Newport mansions that it had converted to academic and residential use. Ochre Court, a massive French chateau built by the Gaulet family in 1892, served as the college's main administration building. Wakehurst, another Gilded Age estate, housed classrooms and offices. Seaview Terrace would provide additional space for administrative functions and possibly student housing. The college purchased the property in August of 1976 for $225,000. Renovations began immediately. The ground floor would contain administrative offices. Upper floors would be converted to student housing. Modern fire suppression systems were installed. Electrical wiring was upgraded. The tower, deemed too dangerous for regular student access, was closed and locked. The total cost of these renovations exceeded $800,000, but the college had the resources to complete the work properly. Salve Regina College, which became Salve Regina University in 1991, has owned Seaview Terrace for nearly 5 decades. The building currently houses administrative offices on the lower floors and serves various functions for the university community. It is known on campus as Carey Mansion, named after George and Edna Carey, who donated funds for its preservation and renovation in 1984. Students who attend classes in the building report the same cold spots and unsettling atmosphere that residents and tenants described for decades before the college acquired the property. The tower remains locked. University administrators cite safety concerns, but maintenance workers who have accessed the space for repairs report that it feels different from the rest of the building in ways they cannot explain. The building's connection to dark shadows has never been forgotten. The university acknowledges this history and occasionally permits media access for articles or documentaries about the show. Fans continue to visit, photographing the exterior from public streets. The university does not offer tours of the interior to the general public, but it has cooperated with Dark Shadows conventions and anniversary celebrations, recognizing that the building's association with the show represents a unique aspect of its history. Several paranormal investigation groups have requested permission to examine Seaview Terrace over the years. The university has consistently declined these requests. The official position is that the building serves an active institutional purpose and cannot be used for entertainment or pseudoscientific investigation. Unofficially, administrators prefer to avoid encouraging supernatural speculation about a property where students live and work. Nevertheless, the stories persist. Students who have lived in Seaview Terrace during its periods of use as dormitory space report experiences similar to those documented in earlier decades. Items disappear and reappear. Doors that were left open stand closed. Footsteps echo in empty hallways. Most students dismiss these occurrences as the normal quirks of an old building, but some find the environment disturbing enough to request transfers to other campus housing. The building's structural condition has required continuous attention. The university has invested millions in maintenance and restoration over the decades. The roof was completely replaced in 1998. The limestone facade underwent extensive cleaning and repair between 2005 and 2008. Windows have been restored or replaced as needed. The interior has been renovated multiple times to meet changing institutional needs and updated building codes. These investments have preserved Seaview Terrace as a functional building and prevented the deterioration that has claimed other Newport estates, but they have also revealed the immense ongoing cost of maintaining structures built during the Gilded Age. The pattern that emerged during the Bradley years has continued through every subsequent ownership. Seaview Terrace demands resources beyond what most owners anticipated. It presents problems that cannot be fully resolved. It affects the people who occupy it in ways that are difficult to document but widely reported. Whether these effects result from the building's design, its history, or some combination of factors remains a matter of interpretation. The roster of tragedies associated with Seaview Terrace can be enumerated with uncomfortable precision. Edson Bradley died in the tower room in 1928. Joseph Friedman lost his entire investment and was forced into bankruptcy by 1936, dying in reduced circumstances in 1942. Dorothy Hammond fell to her death on the main staircase in 1968. A student who lived briefly in the building during its use as dormitory space, in the 1,980 committed suicide 3 months after moving out, though no direct connection to her time at Seaview Terrace was established. 2 maintenance workers died of heart attacks while working in the building during the 1,990. Both men under 60 years old with no prior history of cardiac problems. These deaths, taken individually, can be explained by circumstance, age, or medical conditions. Taken collectively, they suggest a pattern that some find difficult to ignore. The question that has followed Seaview Terrace since the Bradley era remains unresolved. Is the building itself responsible for the misfortunes that have accumulated within its walls, Or does it simply attract people and circumstances that were already troubled? The Gothic imagination insists that places can be cursed, that accumulated tragedy can poison a location. The rational mind rejects such explanations, attributing patterns to coincidence and selective reporting. Both perspectives contain truth. Seaview Terrace stands on its cliff, overlooking the Atlantic, neither cursed nor innocent, simply enduring. The architectural significance of Seaview Terrace was formally recognized in 1975 when it was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The designation acknowledged the building as an outstanding example of French Renaissance Revival architecture and one of the last great mansions constructed during Newport's Gilded Age. The listing provided certain protections against demolition and made the property eligible for historic preservation grants, though it imposed no restrictions on interior modifications. The designation also confirmed what preservationists had argued for decades. Seaview Terrace represented an important chapter in American architectural history, regardless of the troubles that had plagued its owners. Howard Greenlee, the architect who designed the mansion for Edson Bradley, had died in 1963 at the age of 84, long before the building achieved its unexpected fame through Dark Shadows. His career had included dozens of commissions for wealthy clients throughout the Northeast, but Seaview Terrace remained his largest and most ambitious residential work. Architectural historians who have studied Greenlee's portfolio note that he succeeded in creating exactly what Bradley requested, a mansion that could compete with the greatest estates in Newport. That the building also possessed qualities that made it unsuitable for comfortable habitation was not something Greenlee could have anticipated or addressed. The tower, which had figured so prominently in both Bradley's death and the building's Gothic reputation, was the subject of particular architectural interest. Rising 5 stories above the main roofline, it served no practical purpose beyond providing a viewing platform. The spiral staircase that accessed it was narrow and steep. The observation room at the summit measured only 12 feet in diameter, barely large enough to accommodate more than 3 people. From an architectural standpoint, the tower existed purely as a visual gesture, a vertical accent that gave the building a distinctive silhouette when viewed from a distance. That it also created an isolated space where Bradley could retreat from his troubles and where he would eventually die was an unintended consequence of the design. The building's reputation within the Dark Shadows fan community continued to grow through the 1980s and 1990s. Conventions dedicated to the show attracted thousands of attendees who would often make pilgrimages to Newport to photograph Seaview Terrace. The university accommodated these visitors within reasonable limits, understanding that the building's association with the show represented a unique form of cultural heritage. In 1991, when NBC attempted to revive Dark Shadows as a primetime series, the producers returned to Newport to film new exterior footage of Seaview Terrace. The revival was canceled after 12 episodes, but it renewed interest in the original series and brought another wave of visitors to the mansion's gates. The economic value of the Dark Shadows connection proved substantial. Tour operators in Newport began including Seaview Terrace on their routes. Local businesses sold Dark Shadows memorabilia. The Newport Tourism Board recognized that the show had given the city a presence in popular culture that extended beyond its traditional reputation as a summer resort for the wealthy. Seaview Terrace had become, however improbably, one of Newport's most recognizable landmarks. The 2012 film adaptation of Dark Shadows, directed by Tim Burton and starring Johnny Depp as Barnabas Collins, introduced the property to a new generation. Although the film used different locations for most of its shooting, publicity materials referenced Seaview Terrace's role as the original Collinwood. The film's release triggered another surge of interest. The university's public affairs office found itself fielding dozens of media requests. The attention was generally welcome, but it also highlighted the ongoing challenge of managing a property that existed simultaneously as a functional university building and as a location significant to popular culture. By the early 2000s, the physical condition of Seaview Terrace had become a serious concern. The limestone facade, despite cleaning and repairs in the previous decade, continued to deteriorate from exposure to salt air. Water infiltration had damaged interior plasterwork. The tower showed signs of structural stress. The university commissioned a comprehensive structural assessment in 2003. The report concluded that while the building was not in danger of collapse, it required immediate attention to prevent accelerating decay. The estimated cost of necessary repairs was $4.2 million. The university launched a fundraising campaign specifically dedicated to Seaview Terrace's preservation. The campaign emphasized the building's architectural significance and its unique place in popular culture. Dark Shadows fans contributed alongside university alumni and preservation organizations. By 2006, the university had raised sufficient funds to begin the most extensive restoration in the building's history. The work continued through 2009 and addressed both structural and aesthetic concerns. The facade was repaired using limestone sourced to match the original material. The roof was replaced entirely. Interior spaces were renovated to meet current building codes while preserving historic features. The tower was stabilized, but remained closed to regular access. The restoration revealed construction details that had been hidden for decades. Workers discovered that the original plasterwork in the main public rooms had been created by Italian craftsmen brought to Newport specifically for the Bradley Commission. Behind layers of paint, ornamental details emerged that had been covered during earlier renovations. In the tower room, workers found scratches on the window frame that appeared to be tally marks, though their origins and meaning remained unclear. Whether Edson Bradley had made these marks during his final months, or whether they predated his occupancy, could not be determined. The university also commissioned a comprehensive history of the property during this period. A local historian was hired to research the building's past through archival documents, newspaper accounts, and interviews with former residents and workers. The resulting report, completed in 2008, documented the sequence of ownership changes, financial failures, and reported disturbances that had characterized the building's first 80 years. The historian noted the pattern of misfortune but offered no supernatural explanations. Attributing the building's troubled history to economic factors, maintenance challenges, and the general difficulty of sustaining large estates in the 20th century. The question of what to do with the tower remained contentious. Some university officials argued that it should be made accessible to students and visitors. Others maintained that the structural concerns and safety risks justified keeping it closed. The tower's reputation as the site of Bradley's death and as a location where multiple caretakers and maintenance workers had reported feeling uncomfortable also factored into discussions, though administrators were reluctant to acknowledge these concerns formally. The decision reached in 2010 was to leave the tower closed indefinitely, with access permitted only for necessary maintenance and inspections. Dark Shadows celebrated its 45th anniversary in 2011 with events that included a fan gathering in Newport. Several hundred attendees participated in a walking tour that concluded at the gates of Seaview Terrace. The university permitted limited access to the grounds for photographs. Some attendees reported experiencing cold spots or feelings of unease while on the property, but these claims were treated as part of the fan experience, rather than as serious phenomena requiring investigation. The building's status as university property has provided a level of institutional stability that earlier owners never achieved. The university has the resources to maintain the structure properly and the institutional commitment to preserve it for future generations. But even within this stable framework, Seaview Terrace continues to present challenges. Staff members who work in the building regularly request transfers. Students who are assigned to programs housed there often ask to be relocated. Maintenance costs consistently exceed projections. The building requires more attention, more resources, and more management time than comparable structures on campus. University administrators who have dealt with Seaview Terrace over the years speak about it with a mixture of pride and frustration. It is a magnificent building, they acknowledge, an architectural treasure that enhances the campus. It is also a constant source of complications. When pressed to explain the specific difficulties, they cite the usual litany of concerns that accompany old buildings: age, design flaws, deferred maintenance, challenging climate conditions. Few are willing to entertain questions about whether something beyond these practical matters might account for the building's persistent problems. Such speculation, they suggest, is best left to fans of Gothic television. But the pattern continues, adding chapters to a story that refuses to end. Today, Seaview Terrace stands much as it did when Edson Bradley completed construction in 1925. The limestone facade rises above its cliff-edge site, the tower extending toward the sky. The building occupies its 12 acres with the same commanding presence that Bradley intended, visible from Ocean Drive and from the cliff walk that runs along the coast. Nearly a century has passed since the mansion opened. During that time, it has witnessed the collapse of one fortune, the failure of multiple business ventures, the deaths of at least 7 people within its walls, and the transformation of American culture from the Gilded Age through the television era into the digital present. It has served as private residence, social club, apartment building, senior home, and university facility. It has been photographed by millions, studied by architectural historians, investigated by paranormal researchers, and pilgrimage destination for fans of a television show that ended more than 50 years ago. The building currently serves Salve Regina University as an administrative and multi-purpose facility. Offices occupy the ground floor. Meeting rooms and event spaces fill portions of the upper levels. The ballroom, subdivided during the apartment conversion and restored during subsequent renovations, hosts university functions. The library that once held Edson Bradley's collection of first editions now contains file cabinets and modern office equipment. The tower remains locked. Students walk past the building daily without knowing its history beyond its connection to dark shadows. For most of the university community, Seaview Terrace is simply another campus building, notable primarily for its size and architectural distinction. But the reports continue. A facilities manager who worked in the building during the 2010s recounted that equipment malfunctions occurred with unusual frequency. Heating systems would fail in specific rooms while functioning normally elsewhere. Electrical circuits would trip without apparent cause. Doors that were consistently locked would be found standing open in the morning. When pressed to explain these occurrences, the manager acknowledged that old buildings present maintenance challenges. But he also noted that Seaview Terrace presented more challenges than other historic structures on campus, and that the pattern of problems seemed to concentrate in particular areas, specifically the upper floors and the tower staircase. A student who lived briefly in the building during a period when it housed residential space described waking at 3 in the morning to the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside her room. She assumed another resident was returning late from studying. When she opened her door to see who was there, the hallway was empty. The footsteps stopped the moment she opened the door. This occurred on 3 consecutive nights. On the 4th night, she requested a transfer to different housing. Her request was granted without question, suggesting that such transfers were routine. These accounts, and dozens like them spanning decades, establish a pattern that is difficult to dismiss entirely. People who spend time in Seaview Terrace report experiences that they cannot easily explain. These experiences are consistent across different time periods, different types of occupancy, and different populations of residents and workers. The experiences are reported by people who have no prior knowledge of similar reports, suggesting that they are not the result of suggestion or expectation. Whether these experiences reflect genuine paranormal phenomena or simply the psychological effects of occupying a building with a known history of tragedy remains a matter of interpretation. The academic study of allegedly haunted locations has produced no consensus on what distinguishes a genuinely paranormal site from one that merely has a reputation for being haunted. Environmental factors such as infrasound, electromagnetic fields, and air quality can produce physical sensations and psychological effects that people interpret as supernatural. Old buildings with irregular heating and ventilation can create temperature variations and unusual sounds. The power of suggestion can cause people to perceive events as unusual when they might otherwise be ignored. Seaview Terrace presents all of these complicating factors. It is an old building with complex systems. It has a well-documented history of tragedy that anyone researching the property would discover. It has been featured in a Gothic television series that explicitly portrayed it as a haunted mansion. Any investigation must account for these factors before concluding that paranormal activity is occurring. Yet even accounting for all of these variables, the consistency and specificity of reports across nearly a century suggest that something about the building affects people who spend time within its walls. The tower remains the most persistently troubling location. Workers who have accessed it for maintenance describe an atmosphere that differs from the rest of the building. The air feels heavier. The temperature seems lower. The space feels wrong in ways difficult to articulate. These are subjective descriptions, resistant to measurement, but they come from people who have no investment in promoting supernatural interpretations. The question of whether Seaview Terrace is haunted admits no definitive answer. Believers in the paranormal point to the accumulated evidence, the consistent reports, the pattern of tragedy. Skeptics counter that every element can be explained through conventional means, that the pattern reflects economic and social factors rather than supernatural influence. Both positions contain truth. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is that Seaview Terrace occupies a space between categories. It is neither definitively haunted nor entirely mundane. It is a building where beauty and tragedy have coexisted for nearly a century, where architectural ambition created spaces that have proven difficult for people to occupy comfortably, where the accumulation of history has given the structure a weight that visitors can feel even if they cannot explain. Whether that weight derives from paranormal forces or from the psychological impact of knowing the building's past may be less important than acknowledging that the weight exists. The building's survival represents a triumph. Dozens of Newport mansions have been demolished over the past century. The economic forces that made estates like Seaview Terrace unsustainable for private owners destroyed most of their contemporaries. That Seaview Terrace still stands, still functions, still draws visitors to its gates, suggests a form of resilience that transcends the misfortunes that plagued its early owners. The building has outlived everyone who contributed to its troubled reputation. Edson Bradley, Joseph Friedman, the succession of owners who struggled to make it profitable, the caretakers who fled, the residents who died. All are gone. The building remains. Salve Regina University's stewardship has provided what earlier arrangements could not: the institutional resources and long-term commitment necessary to maintain a structure of this scale. The university has no intention of selling the property. It has invested millions in restoration and continues to budget for ongoing maintenance. The building has been integrated into the campus in ways that ensure its preservation for the foreseeable future. Whatever else might be said about Seaview Terrace, it will not be demolished. It will not fall into ruin. It will stand on its cliff for generations to come. The tower still rises above the roofline, its observation room still accessible by the narrow spiral staircase, though locked against casual entry. The gardens have been replanted and maintained. The ballroom still exists, divided and restored, and adapted to contemporary purposes. The building is both preserved and transformed, neither purely historic nor fully modern, existing in the uncomfortable space between past and present where so many historic properties find themselves. For visitors who approach Seaview Terrace today, what they encounter depends largely on what they bring with them: Fans of dark shadows see Collinwood. Architecture enthusiasts see a remarkable example of French Renaissance revival style. Students see a campus building. Believers in the paranormal see a genuinely haunted location. Skeptics see an old building with a reputation that exceeds its reality. All of these perspectives contain elements of truth. Seaview Terrace is all of these things simultaneously. There is a mansion on the Rhode Island coast that has stood for nearly a century, watching the Atlantic waves crash against the cliffs below. It has housed millionaires and pensioners, served as apartments and dormitories, appeared in 1,000 television episodes and countless photographs. It has witnessed deaths and bankruptcies, departures and arrivals, tragedies both dramatic and mundane. It has been called beautiful and oppressive, magnificent and troubling, cursed and merely unfortunate. After a century of occupation by dozens of different owners, residents, and institutions, one certainty remains. Seaview Terrace endures. It stands on its cliff, neither fully understood nor entirely mysterious, adding to its history with each passing year, still demanding more from those who occupy it than most buildings require, still presenting challenges that resist simple solutions. The mansion that Edson Bradley built to announce his greatness became instead a monument to the limits of human ambition and the persistence of places that refuse to be ordinary. It will stand long after everyone who currently knows its stories has departed, accumulating new chapters, new residents, new mysteries. The building endures because that is what buildings do. They outlast us all.